The wind howled through the empty barn when he found her a trembling foal, tied to a post, half frozen under the pale light of dawn. Her halter was frayed, her breath shallow, and around her neck hung a crumpled note. The cowboy's calloused fingers shook as he untied it, reading words that hit harder than any bullet he'd ever taken. By the time he reached the last line, his eyes burned with tears he thought he'd buried years ago. Whoever left that note hadn't just abandoned a horse, they'd left behind a story of heartbreak and mercy. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wind hadn't let up since midnight, whistling through the eaves like some restless ghost. Eli Conroy rose before the sun, the cold biting at his bones as he lit the barn lantern and stepped into the storm's gray aftermath. Snowdrifts pressed against the walls, frost curling along the edges of every board. The rattle had stirred him from uneasy sleep, wood thudding, maybe a loose shutter or worse, a restless animal. He hadn't expected this. In the far corner of the barn, half covered in hay and shadow, stood a foal, small, skeletal, soaked to the skin. Her legs shook beneath her, one hoof curled under as if too weak to bear her own weight. The whites of her eyes flashed with panic as he approached, breath rising in short, ragged clouds. A length of frayed rope kept her tied to a post, too tight around the halter cutting into her neck. Dried blood clung to the edges of her matted fur. Eli's hand went still when he saw it, something fluttering from her halter, damp and yellowed at the corners. A note, folded, crumpled, and tied with a bit of twine. He pulled it free, the paper tearing slightly in his gloved fingers. The ink had run in places, but the words still held. Simple, desperate. Please take care of her. I couldn't let Pa shoot her. She's all I had left of Mama. I'm sorry. His throat closed as he read it again, slower this time, every word scraping raw across something buried deep inside him. The last line, I'm sorry, was underlined twice, as if the boy who wrote it knew the guilt would never let him go. A name followed in shaky letters. Tommy, age 10. Eli stared down at the foal, his fingers trembling now, the edges of the paper curling in the wind. She tried to step back, but the rope tugged hard, jerking her head. A sharp cry left her, too soft to echo. He dropped to his knees beside her, reaching slowly, whispering something he couldn't even hear himself say. She flinched at first, then stilled. He loosened the bedivis, roped gently, fingers brushing the wound beneath the halter. It was swollen, red, crusted with dirt. Whoever had done this hadn't meant for her to be found. They'd left her to die in the cold. A flash of memory hit him. Another small body, another winter, another desperate night, the fever that took his daughter, the silence that came after. He pressed his hand to the foal's neck, feeling the faint pulse there, fragile as a whisper. You ain't alone anymore, he murmured hoarsely, not sure if he meant it for her or for himself. Snowflakes fell heavier now, catching in the lantern's glow, and all around them the wind howled, as if the land itself was mourning. Eli rose with the foal leaning into his side, cradling the note like scripture in his coat pocket. Something had been left in that barn besides an animal. It was a plea, a wound, a second chance written in a child's trembling hand, and Eli Conroy, long closed to the world, could no longer turn away. Eli stood frozen in the barn's silence, the wind outside muffled by thick wooden walls, but something louder roared in his chest, the kind of sound that comes from memory clawing its way up through the years. The note trembled in his hand, ink smudged, edges torn where it had been hastily folded and tied. The handwriting was unmistakably a child's, uneven, large, a mixture of fear and urgency in every stroke. Asterisk, please take care of her. I couldn't let Pa shoot her. She's all I had left of Mama. I'm sorry. Asterisk, Eli mouthed the words, lips barely moving, as if saying them aloud might make them less real. He read it again, slower, the weight behind each sentence settling like dust in his bones. The mention of the boy's mama made something twist deep in Eli's gut. He remembered his own wife's voice, soft and low in the evenings when she sang lullabies to their daughter. Remembered how her absence had left the air too still, the house too silent. He blinked, but the tears came anyway, hot against the cold of the barn. The ink bled beneath a drop that hit the page, and still his eyes scanned the final line. Asterisk, Tommy, age 10. Asterisk, the name blurred. but the pain in it remained sharp. A boy no older than 10 had made a decision that carried the weight of a man's grief. Had walked through snow, maybe under cover of night, carrying a foal in his arms, or leading her by rope, desperate to save what he could from a father too cruel to understand love, too broken to see worth in something small and defenseless. Eli's gaze shifted from the note to the foal. She stood now, barely, ribs sharp under her dull coat, eyes wide and glassy. She didn't shy away this time when he moved closer, didn't flinch when he placed a hand on her neck. Maybe she sensed something in him, some understanding, some shared sorrow. He crouched beside her again, ran his hand slowly down her side, felt every bone. "Tommy," he whispered. The name, catching like splinters in his throat. "You did right, son." He folded the note with care, smoothing its edges, then tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, close to his chest. He didn't know why, maybe because it felt like a sacred thing, like a confession that needed to be carried. Maybe because it was the first honest cry for help he'd heard in a long time. As he stood, he looked around the barn, its familiar walls now holding something more than hay and dust. It held a secret, a promise, a cry unanswered, and it held him, Eli Conroy, a man who'd thought his story was finished, now drawn into someone else's pain. He wrapped the foal in a wool blanket, gathered from the tack room, and brought her closer to the stove in the corner of the barn, stoking it until the flames came alive again. "You're safe now," he muttered, voice cracking. He wasn't sure if he was saying it to the foal or to himself. The snow fell steady outside, and for the first time in years, Eli felt something stir in the silence. Not just sorrow, but purpose. The kind that comes when one broken heart reaches out to mend another. Eli worked with the quiet determination of a man who'd known too many winters alone. He carried the foal deeper into the barn, away from the draft, setting her gently beside the iron stove he hadn't used in years. The rust groaned as he forced the door open, shoving kindling in with calloused fingers, striking match after match until the fire finally caught, coughing up heat in fits and starts. The foal lay still, her breathing shallow but steady. He fetched a stack of horse blankets from the tack room, laying them beneath and around her, then stripped off his own coat and draped it over her back. She tensed at the touch, but didn't cry out. Her ears twitched, legs folding under her, eyes never leaving his. He moved slow, like approaching a scared child, because that's what she was. Really. Just a child that didn't understand why the world had turned cold overnight. From a wooden shelf he pulled an old tin of powdered milk, the kind he used to keep for emergencies back when the ranch had more mouths to feed. He hadn't touched it since before his daughter's final spring. Boiling water on the stovetop, he stirred in the powder, the smell rising warm and faintly sweet in the chilled barn air. He knelt beside her again, holding a cloth-wrapped bottle to her mouth. She sniffed it, turned away once, then finally latched on, the instinct to survive stronger than fear. Her body trembled with every swallow, and Eli could see how close she'd come to giving up. "Easy now," he muttered, barely above a whisper, his hand resting gently on her tangled mane. He stroked it slowly, fingers brushing over knots and burrs. His throat tightened with every pass. He told himself not to look too closely, not to think too much. But those eyes, round, wide, full of hurt she didn't understand, stared up at him like they were searching for something. And suddenly he saw her face, not the foal's, his daughter's, feverish, pale, reaching for him from the bed as the snow howled outside their cabin years ago. The way she'd cried for him when he went to get the doctor, how he'd returned too late. The same helpless fear in those eyes now stared up at him from this fragile creature. His jaw clenched, breath hitching, and still he kept stroking, kept whispering soft words that made no sense but felt like they mattered. "You're all right now. You're all right." The foal finished drinking and rested her head against the blanket, her eyes fluttering half shut. Eli sat there a long while, legs numb, fire crackling behind him. The barn seemed smaller, somehow warmer, not from the stove, but from the weight of what had just happened. She'd trusted him, needed him, and for the first time in years, something had looked at Eli Conroy not with judgment or pity, but with hope. A scared little soul had been left to die in his care, and in saving her, a part of himself he thought long dead had begun to flicker back to life. He looked down, at her again, whispered, "You ain't her, but I think she sent you anyway." Then he sat back, wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, and fed the fire until the cold started to back away. By the time the gray morning sun pushed through the thinning storm clouds, Eli was already tightening the cinch on his saddle, the cold biting at his knuckles but failing to numb the fire burning in his chest. The note still rested in his coat pocket, folded and soft now from how many times he'd read it. The name Tommy echoing louder in his head than the crunch of hooves on snow. No last name, no town mentioned, but Eli had recognized the paper it was written on. It wasn't scrap or feed ledger, it was school paper, the kind with faint blue lines and frayed edges from being torn out of a child's notebook. That meant one thing: the homestead school 10 miles east, the only one left still teaching through the winter. He rode slow, scanning the trees and gullies as if the boy might suddenly appear like a shadow between the brush. But he didn't expect to find him, not yet. This trip was about starting the trail, not ending it. When he reached the schoolhouse, a squat, wooden building leaning into the wind, the teacher, Miss Alder, met him with cautious eyes. She was young but worn down, the kind of woman who saw too much and said too little. Eli dismounted, removed his hat, and offered the note without a word. Her brows furrowed as she read, lips pressed in a line. "Tommy," she whispered, confirming what he'd hoped. Tommy Granger. He was sweet, too quiet for a 10-year-old. Came in with bruises some days, wore the same coat all fall. She hesitated, then looked up at Eli. "Stopped coming about 3 weeks ago. I went out there once, Granger Homestead, 2 ridges west." His pa met me at the gate with a bottle in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Said the boy was sick, but I saw no smoke from the chimney. Her voice cracked slightly. "That man don't care for animals, or children who act soft." Eli's jaw tightened. He knew the type: men who drank themselves cruel, who saw tenderness as weakness, who let the world rot around them because something inside them had already died. "Tommy tried to bring a foal to school once," she added quietly, eyes drifting to the snow-dusted hills. "Said his mama used to read to it in the barn before she passed. That boy loved that horse like it was family." Eli nodded, tucking the note back into his pocket like a relic, sacred and urgent. The wind picked up as he stepped back onto his stirrup, the sky beginning to clear. "You think he's alive?" she called after him, voice soft but shaking. Eli paused, then looked over his shoulder, eyes shaded by the brim of his hat. "If he wrote this and walked her all the way to me," he said, "he's got more fight in him than most men I've met." And with that, he turned his horse back toward the hills, toward a homestead rotting under a man's bitterness, toward a trail gone cold but not yet lost. He didn't have a map, but he had a name, a note, and the weight of a promise. Somewhere out there was a boy who'd risked everything for a creature no one else wanted. And Eli Conroy wasn't the kind of man to let that kind of courage vanish into the snow. The road home stretched long and lonesome beneath the slate-colored sky, but Eli barely noticed the cold. As it sliced through his coat, his thoughts were tangled in the broken lines of a boy's note and the bruises Miss Alder hadn't needed to describe. By the time he reached his ranch, the clouds had split open, letting in a pale, tired sun that did little to warm the land. He dismounted slow, eyes scanning the yard until they found her huddled near the fence of the small corral, her thin legs tucked under her, the blankets he'd wrapped her in slipping down to the mud. At the sound of his boots, she stirred, lifted her head, and tried to stand. Her back right leg dragged behind her, stiff and trembling with the effort. She faltered after a few steps, fell hard into the dirt, then lay still again, chest rising shallow and fast. Eli's throat tightened. He climbed over the rail and knelt beside her, hands gentle as he checked her leg, no open wound, but the joint was swollen, likely twisted when she was forced to run or fell during the night she was abandoned. She didn't pull away this time. Her eyes followed him, not with fear but something closer to trust. And that undid him. He lowered himself beside her, leaning his back against the fence, and stared out across the field where snow still clung to the grass in stubborn patches. His mind wandered without permission back to another winter, the last one with his daughter. She'd been 7 when the fever came. One day she was laughing in the kitchen, brushing her doll's hair with her fingers. 2 days later, she couldn't lift her head from the pillow. He'd ridden through a storm for the doctor, swore he'd be back before nightfall. But the creek had flooded, and the bridge had collapsed. By the time he returned, she was gone. Her tiny hand curled around the edge of her quilt, like she'd been waiting. He buried her beneath the cedar tree behind the house, beside her mother, and hadn't spoken her name aloud since. Not once. Until now. "She looked like you," he whispered, laying a hand on the foal's neck. "Eyes just like yours, soft and scared and holding on to hope." He didn't mean to say it, but it came anyway. A breath-turned confession. He felt something shift then, deep in his chest. Not a breaking, but a stirring. A stirring of something he thought long frozen over. He looked down at her, at the trembling body that had refused to die in the cold, at the child who had no voice and yet said everything in her eyes. "Promise," he said, the word hitching in his throat before settling with finality. "That's your name now. Not just a name, a vow, that she'd never be left again, that he wouldn't fail this time, that whatever hurt Tommy had run from would end here. He'd keep her safe, keep looking, keep remembering. And maybe, in doing so, he'd find a piece of himself buried beneath all the years he'd spent trying not to feel." The wind picked up again, tugging at his coat. Promise leaned her head against his leg, and he let his hand rest atop her mane, fingers brushing slowly, the silence between them speaking louder than words ever could. It started with a whisper in the back corner of the feed store, carried on the dusty breath of men who talked too loud when they'd said too much. Eli was there for oats, nothing more. But when he heard the name Granger and the words, "thievin' little bastard," his spine went rigid. One of the clerks mentioned a man stinking of rotgut and fury had been staggering through town, spitting about how his boy ran off with a foal that weren't worth the bullet I was fixin' to put in her. Eli didn't ask for more. He just turned, dropped his coin on the counter, and rode straight for town, jaw tight, breath shallow. Main Street was quiet that late in the afternoon, but the shouting reached him before the saloon came into view, a slurry of curses and wild slurs, a voice too loud to be sober. Eli dismounted slow, tied his reins, and stepped into the street's long shadow, hands steady but clenched. The man in question, Joe Granger, stood near the water trough, waving an empty bottle at a couple of cowhands who looked eager to be anywhere else. He was red-faced, thick around the middle, eyes clouded with drink and something darker. "Little runt's hiding somewhere," he slurred. "Took that damned foal. Should have slit her throat when I had the chance. Just like her mama." That stopped Eli cold, the way he said it. Not just like livestock, but like a wound, like something personal and vile. Eli stepped closer, slow, boots crunching on dry dirt. Granger turned, bottle raised half-heartedly, and squinted. "You looking at me for?" he barked. Eli said nothing. Didn't need to. His eyes locked on Granger's and something passed between them, quiet, sharp, unforgiving. The kind of silence that made lesser men rethink their next word. Granger puffed up, staggered forward a step, then stopped. Maybe it was Eli's stance. Maybe it was something older in his eyes grief turned to steel. "Ain't your business," Granger muttered, waving the bottle. "Boy's gone soft. Crying over horses like they was people. That mare birthed a useless foal, just like his mother birthed him." He spat at the ground, then tried to swagger off toward the saloon, but stumbled, catching himself on the post out front. No one followed. No one helped. No one spoke. That was the way of it in towns like this. They'd all heard the stories, seen the bruises, but turned their eyes the other way. The sheriff wouldn't touch it, said there was no crime if no one filed it. Said the law couldn't chase whispers. Eli stood still a long while, even after Granger vanished inside, the swinging saloon doors creaking behind him like a curse. His fists were balled so tight his knuckles had gone white. Every instinct in him screamed for justice, quick, final, hard. But Promise's face flashed in his mind. Tommy's letter. And the fire that had started in his chest back in that barn didn't want vengeance. It wanted to protect. He turned, back toward his horse, mounted with slow deliberation, and rode out of town without a word. If the law wouldn't shield them, if the town wouldn't see the child beneath the bruises or the life in the foal's eyes, then Eli Conroy would do it himself. He wasn't a hero, wasn't trying to be, but he knew what it was to lose something precious, and this time, he'd fight to keep it breathing. The days slipped by in quiet rhythm. the kind that settled into Eli's bones like an old song he hadn't heard in years. The wind still blew hard across the ridgeline, but the worst of the frost had started to retreat, leaving behind damp soil and the early stirrings of spring. In the barn, Promise stood taller now, still thin, still cautious, but there was life in her eyes again, and when Eli called, she came. Her limp had eased to a hitch, barely noticeable when she trotted beside him along the fence line, her coat no longer dull but catching the sun in soft flickers of gold. He fed her oats from his palm, warmed mash in the mornings, brushed her down each night beneath the glow of a single oil lamp, the barn quieter than any church. There was peace in the routine, but it was the note that never left him. Folded and worn, it lived in the breast pocket of his coat by day, and at night he laid it flat beside his journal, copying the words line for line. Please take care of her. I couldn't let Pa shoot her. His pen moved slow, deliberate, like transcribing scripture. The child's handwriting had become sacred to him, its shaky courage, its quiet heartbreak. He wrote it not for record, but for remembrance. Because those words had cracked open something inside him that had been sealed shut for too long. Each time he finished writing them, he'd stare at the last line. Asterisk. I'm sorry. Asterisk. And every time, it made his chest ache. He hadn't found Tommy, not yet, but he'd stopped believing the boy was gone. There were signs. Once, he found the trough refilled before dawn when he hadn't touched it. Another time, his axe left stuck in the chopping block had been laid neatly across the woodpile come morning. He noticed bread going missing from the kitchen. He never said anything, just left more. Always more. A tin of stew by the tree line. A blanket folded by the shed. A small sack of jerky tucked in the hayloft with a note that read only, asterisk. She's all right. Asterisk, he left that note unsigned. Figured the boy would know. Some nights, he stood out on the porch long after the sun dropped behind the hills, eyes sweeping the edge of the woods, wondering if Tommy was out there in the dark, watching Promise gallop short, clumsy laps around the corral, wondering if he was waiting for proof that it was safe to come home. Eli never called out. He knew better than to spook something already so afraid. But every night before turning in, he walked the length of the barn and looked out toward the trees and whispered, "You're not forgotten." Then he'd turn back, hand brushing Promise's neck as she lay curled in the straw, and feel a strange stillness settle in him like maybe, despite everything, something good had found its way back into the world. Not loud, not triumphant, just broken, but breathing. Just enough. The fog hung thick over the fields like a quilt stitched from silence, muting the morning with a softness that felt almost holy. Eli stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, when he caught it just the briefest flicker of movement at the tree line, a shadow smaller than a man but too tall to be any animal. It froze, then darted back into the woods, vanishing like mist through pine. Eli didn't call out, didn't move. His heart beat once, hard, then slowed. He knew. There was only one soul that could have crept that close without the dogs barking, who'd known how to stay hidden without leaving tracks in the snow. Tommy. The boy had been watching maybe for days, maybe longer. Eli set the cup down without a word and walked to the barn, Promise already stirring in her stall. Her ears perked as he approached, and when he knelt to refill her water, he thought he saw her glance toward the window like she, too, had noticed something just beyond the edge of sight. That afternoon, Eli built the fire high in the corner stove, dragged a spare blanket over a pile of hay in the loft, and left out a tin of beef stew beside a chunk of bread wrapped in cloth. No questions, no traps, just an open door. Before leaving, he scribbled on a scrap of brown paper. Asterisk. She's safe. You were brave. Asterisk. He folded it, placed it beside the food, and stepped away. That night, he didn't wait on the porch. He went inside, lit the lantern by the window, and left it burning low. Morning came slow and pale, the fog still clinging to the grass like breath on glass. When Eli entered the barn, Promise was resting, content, and the stew was gone. So was the bread. The blanket had been shifted, creased as if someone had laid there briefly, then left before dawn. But what caught his breath was the small piece of torn notebook paper lying beside the Foal's pen. written in the same shaky hand that had once begged him to save her. Another note. Asterisk, thank you. I didn't know where else to go. Asterisk. Eli sat down on the edge of a hay bale, the paper trembling in his fingers. His throat tightened, but he didn't cry. Not this time. He just smiled, small, quiet, a thing made of equal parts relief and ache. Tommy was still out there, still watching, still carrying a weight no child should have to bear. But he hadn't run. He'd come back. That meant something. Meant Trust hadn't died in the cold. Meant Eli hadn't failed. He folded the boy's note, pressed it against his chest, and whispered, "You found the right place." Then he stood, fed Promise her morning mash, and left a new blanket folded in the loft, another tin of stew, and a clean shirt small enough for a 10-year-old boy. No need to speak, no need to chase. He knew now that trust, like healing, wasn't a thing you forced. It had to be built slow, steady, and honest. And out here, under the wide western sky, two broken things were finding their way back to one another, one silent step at a time. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of thawing earth and wood smoke as a pale sun rose over the ridge, casting long shadows across the pasture. Eli was tending to the fence post near the north line when he caught the stillness, one that didn't belong to the land but to someone standing just beyond it. He turned slowly and saw him, a small figure at the edge of the tree line, motionless as a fence post, skinny arms crossed tight over a threadbare coat. The boy's face was pale, streaked with dirt, and his hair hung in damp curls over his forehead, but Eli knew instantly. Tommy. Not a ghost, not a rumor, but real. Shaking, flesh and bone and too many sleepless nights packed into a 10-year-old's frame. Eli didn't rush. He set his hammer down, brushed the sawdust off his hands, and began walking across the pasture slow, boots crunching over brittle grass, heart beating a little too loud in his ears. "Mornin', son," he said softly as he approached, stopping. Just a few paces away. Tommy didn't speak, didn't nod, just stared at the ground, shoulders drawn in like he expected to be hit, shamed, or sent away. Eli felt the heat rise in his chest, anger at what had been done to this boy, and sorrow that he'd come to expect so little kindness from the world. Before Eli could say more, a soft whinny cut through the quiet. Promise had seen them. She trotted from the corral gate, hooves light on the grass, ears forward, tail swaying behind her. She stopped in front of the boy and, without hesitation, nudged his chest with her muzzle, gentle, insistent, familiar. Tommy's arms dropped. He stared at her like he couldn't quite believe it. Then he fell to his knees. The sob that tore from him wasn't loud, but it carried all the weight of someone who'd held on too long without letting go. He buried his face in her neck, arms wrapping around her fragile frame as she stood perfectly still, breathing soft and steady. Eli knelt beside him, not saying a word. He didn't have to. His hand settled on the boy's shoulder, solid, warm, and still. The silence between them stretched, heavy not with fear but with understanding. Two people who'd lost too much. Two people who had no more words left for grief. The wind stirred the grass around them, rustling the trees like a lullaby. Tommy didn't pull away, and Promise didn't move, and Eli just stayed there beside them, letting the moment pass slow and real. He didn't ask where the boy had been or how long he'd slept out in the cold. Didn't ask what had finally brought him back. Some things didn't need questions. They just needed presence. Needed a hand on your back when the world had turned hard. As the sun climbed higher, Eli finally spoke soft, steady. "You're home now. That's all that matters." Tommy nodded without looking up, and in that simple motion, something shifted like a gate opening after years of rust, like a promise made good by nothing, more than quiet staying. Eli stood and offered his hand. Tommy took it, and together they walked back toward the barn, where the fire was still burning and the day like the boy was just beginning again. Spring came like a slow breath drawn after too long underwater, coaxing color back into the land one green blade at a time. The snow had melted into dark soil, the trees budding soft with promise, and the pasture that once held only silence now rang with the sound of hoofbeats and laughter. Tommy was different now, still quiet, still cautious but stronger, surer. Each morning he rose with the sun and helped Eli muck the stalls, feed the stock, haul buckets from the well. His hands, once delicate and trembling, were callousing with work. He didn't flinch at sudden sounds anymore, didn't sleep curled into corners, and Promise, true to her name, had become a creature reborn, muscle layered now over her once starved frame, her gait fluid and fast as she tore across the hillside, tail high, mane catching the wind like wildfire. She always circled back to Tommy, nuzzling his shoulder, and he always greeted her like she was a friend, not a pet. From the porch, Eli sat watching them, his old journal open across his lap. The leather cover was cracked, the pages dog-eared, but today he lingered on one in particular, the page he'd rewritten more times than he could count. The note, asterisk, "Please take care of her. I couldn't let Pa shoot her. She's all I had left of Mama. I'm sorry." Asterisk, the boy who had written those words wasn't gone. He was out there now in the yard, laughing as Promise reared beside him, barefoot and wild with joy. Eli read the note once more, slowly, lips moving with each syllable like prayer. Then he folded it carefully, tucking it between two pages, and shut the journal for the last time. He laid it beside him and leaned back in his chair, letting the breeze roll over his face, heavy with the scent of lilac and sun-warmed earth. He'd buried so much in this soil, his wife, his daughter, whole seasons of grief, but today the land didn't feel like a grave. It felt like something alive, something open. He thought of how Tommy had arrived with nothing but a foal and a fear too big for his chest. Thought of how Promise had bridged the silence between them without a single word. Some losses never left you. They lived in your bones, came back in dreams, in cold mornings and long silences. But mercy had a strange way of finding its way through on four legs, with soft eyes, or in the shape of a broken boy who still believed someone out there might care enough to read his note and answer it. Eli looked out over the fields, at the boy who had once been a shadow on the edge of the woods, now sprinting through sunlight. He breathed deep, the kind of breath that reached all the way down, and let it go slow. For the first time in years, there was no ache riding its tail, just peace. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. A beginning. And as Promise whinnied across the hills and Tommy turned back with that half-smile he gave when he wasn't sure it was okay to be happy, Eli nodded. Yeah, this was enough. Maybe even more than enough.